Preparing for and installing Configuration Manager 2012. All right, Greg, stop talking now and show me how to use this solution. That's probably what you're thinking at this point. But that's okay. As I said before you can start clicking buttons, you have to spend some time really understanding why you're clicking those buttons and what you're aiming to achieve. And hopefully in that last nugget I spent a little bit of time helping you understand that there's a lot of moving parts to this whole thing. You know, turning Config Manager on is more than just clicking Next, Next, Finish. You've got to figure out, well, of all the different things it can do, which ones do you want to turn on? Which ones do you need to use? And how, in what order do you need to turn them, essentially make them available to your users? Obviously, before we can even get to that point, we have to get the thing installed. And admittedly, this used to be a really, really challenging process. Back in 07 and 03 days, and even in the SMS 2.0 days, getting Config Manager installed, getting SMS installed required a lot of steps. These days, not so bad. Microsoft has built this prerequisite checker into the last version and this version of Config Manager that does a pretty decent job of making sure you have all the stuff put together correctly. Now, one thing though, I'm going to help you out in quite a few ways, because what I've done is put together a step-by-step checklist, a cheat sheet, if you will, for all the things that you're going to need in order to prepare yourself before you even double-click setup.msi or setup.exe for Config Manager itself. What's interesting is that even before we even get to that point, you've been doing IT for a while, so have I. And we've all been dealing with these Microsoft recommendations for hardware requirements. And all these recommendations are sort of interesting because back in the day they were sort of silly, right? I think you could get Windows NT installed in like 16 meg of RAM or something, even though the rest of us knew that the reality it was a lot larger than that. So after essentially an eternity of dealing with recommendations that were too low, the recommendations for Config Manager 2012 now are almost too high. This will make you laugh. Okay, so here I brought up Internet Explorer, and there is a website on TechNet called Planning for Hardware Configurations for Configuration Manager. So prepare yourself. All right, can you guess what kind of hardware Microsoft thinks you need to set up just a single server Config Manager environment? Can you guess? 2 gigs of RAM? 2 procs? Maybe not so much. If we scroll down here and we take a look at the site servers, the central administration site for a Config Manager environment needs 8 cores and 32 gigs of RAM. Holy cow. It's just a ridiculous amount of horsepower that's required to support this. A standalone primary site, which is the site that we will be using here for most of this series, also requires 8 gigs, 32 gigs of RAM, and something like a half a T of hard disk space. Now that is for supporting up to 100,000 clients. Most of us don't have the need for up to 100,000 clients. Okay, so your real requirements here are going to be somewhat less than that. I will tell you that, and we'll see this here in just a second, but 8 gigabytes GB if I can spell, 8 gigabytes is the recommended minimum amount of RAM for a Config Manager server. So this is 32 for 100,000 clients, but you will get a little warning message if you don't have at least 8 gigs of RAM in that machine. Multiply that times 2 machines. If you end up doing a central site environment, you're looking at 2 fairly beefy machines just to get started. So recognize that, well, there are, as I said, there are some hefty hardware requirements. There are also some substantial software requirements too. I mean, you have to have a copy of SQL. Okay, most of us usually get the Enterprise Edition. If you have a secondary site, secondary sites can support SSX, SQL Server Express, but your central site and your primary sites have to have SQL in addition to Windows Server. So again, just know this, because before you begin down the path of System Center, you're going to have all this stuff in place. In this nugget, we're going to spend some time preparing Active Directory for Config Manager. There actually is a schema extension that is required, generally recommended, it's not required. And I'll show you how to do that. Don't worry, I'll give you some good advice for how you can get that schema extension through your usual whatever process you have to go through to get stuff approved. We're also going to prepare the site server. I have done most of the activities already in preparing the site server. I will just show them to you so you're aware of them, but if you just follow the steps on your own, you'll get to the point where you can go about the really cool part, which is getting this whole thing installed. That's really the point here. So let me, even before we go there, I want to scroll this page down to this nice little cheat sheet that I put together for you that should give you a really good idea about what you need to have prepared before you ever pull the DVD out for Config Manager. So number one is build yourself a Windows Server 2008 R2 server. Okay? If you're watching this video later on in the 2012 days, one assumes that Config Manager will be supportable for 2012. I mean, it just makes sense. But today, 2012 is not released in a production sense, so I'll call this 2008 R2, but you can kind of, in your own mind, sort of replace it with 2012. And potentially some differences here when we get to those days at some point here in the future. Once you install that, install it, get it patched, then install SQL Server 2008 R2 SP1 CU6. Right, now, again, this is, what is this? Just a few months after its release. This is June of 2012 when this is being filmed. And so those are the specific requirements for SQL Server today. And those will evolve as R2 comes out, one assumes, and new service packs come out. But you do have to have the SP1 and the CU6, which is Cumulative Update 6 or greater of SQL Server for Config Manager to work. Okay, this is just a hard requirement. If you are in a non-English speaking country, your SQL collation may not be set to this SQL collation here, which is Latin General CP1 CIAS. Okay, right out of the box with the US English version of SQL, that is the default setting for SQL collation. But Config Manager, even if you're in a different language, requires that collation in order to function. Okay, so I'll show you where that's at here in just a minute. And also there is, after you install Config Manager, there is this little change you've got to do your SQL Server in order to set up its process memory allocation. Okay, SQL by default will try to consume as much RAM as is available. And so we're going to dial that RAM down to a maximum of about 8 gigs. In fact, a minimum and a maximum of about 8 gigs. Got to have a couple of features installed as well. .NET Framework 3.5.1. Okay, do not install the WCF activation, just the .NET Framework 3.5.1 and bits and RDC, so remote differential compression. So bits, as you will find out, is the technology that allows us to throttle all the network communication that occurs between servers and servers to clients. Very useful for latent WAN connections, but is a foundation of the communication that occurs in a Config Manager infrastructure. Also leans on RDC too, to ensure that stuff goes in the most efficient way possible. You will also need to install .NET Framework version 4 if it's not already installed as part of your synchronizing your server with Windows Update. Okay, I think mine automatically brought it in as an optional update when you go to Windows Update, but make sure you get .NET Framework 4 installed. Now, when you go about installing some of these Windows features, and I can't remember if it's .NET Framework or BIT, but one of these two will install IIS and a series, a limited set of IIS functionality. When it completes, you then need to go back to IIS and install these additional role services associated with IIS. Okay, don't do the cheating way out and install everything, but just the specific role services that Configuration Manager needs. And in order to make this easy for you, I've listed them here. Just click down through the list and make sure all of those are available. That will prepare your server. When you've completed that, the last step you're going to do is run a Config Manager pre-check and then install it. Okay, we'll do all of that here in just a second. However, before you even get there, okay, before you start with Config Manager, there's a couple of things that you're going to want to do that are associated with Active Directory. One of which is to create just an SMS admin account, which we will use to facilitate some of the authentication here. That SMS admin account, or whatever you want to call it, you can name it whatever you want, for this step in the game, we'll use it later on also, but for this step in the game is going to be used for essentially creating, provisioning that database, that SQL database. So the account needs to be introduced into SQL. So you create the account Active Directory, and then you create the account in SQL, and then you need to assign that account the sysadmin role inside of SQL Server. I'll show you how to do that. And then the last bit. This is the part that's going to take probably some time, and it honestly depends on, well, it depends on your approval processes that you might have to go through to get these things done. So built into Active Directory are a number of different containers. They're folders that contain data for the Active Directory database. This is the ADSI edit tool that you've probably feared for a long time, for good reason, because the ADSI edit tool can do some really, really horrible things if you're not very careful with it. But what you need to do is create a folder, a container titled System Management in Active Directory. It's spelled exactly that way with those caps and that space in Active Directory, because Config Manager is going to populate that container with just a couple of records that clients can use to find your Config Manager servers. You don't have to have this. If you don't have it, there are other ways in which the clients can find your Config Manager servers. But it's generally a good idea because this publishing of these items in Active Directory makes the whole process of finding Config Manager servers, especially when you've got multiple sites going on, much, much easier. So we need to create that container and then delegate the server account for your Config Manager servers, full control access to the container. Okay, our server that we're going to be working with here is going to be named config, C-O-N-F-I-G, MGR1. And if you recall, there will be an account, a computer account in Active Directory called that $. And that's the account that we're going to assign full control access to the container here. Then lastly is this extension of the Active Directory schema if you have not done it already. Okay, if you've done it for previous versions of Config Manager, you won't need to do it again, I think, I believe. And that schema extension is always a nightmare getting it through your approval processes, but let me help you out with that. Okay, I'll give you some pointers for how to get this through all of your approval processes for doing schema extensions. All right, so here's our server, config MGR1. We'll be working with the server for pretty much almost the entirety of this series, pretty much exclusively. So config MGR1 is the server. I first want to actually just kind of show you that I've installed a few of the roles here. I have the web server role on here, and there's a couple of features I've installed too. The .NET Framework 3.5.1, not the WCF activation. I've installed bits, and then RDC is down here. Okay, so these pieces are already installed onto this computer at this point. What we want to do at this point is take a look at SQL and make sure that SQL's actually been installed with all the proper, pieces in place. Now, they're not set correctly right out of the box. Okay, so there's a couple of things we have to do to kind of prepare things for Config Manager. The first of which is done by viewing the properties of the server itself. And let me do my little pen here because I want to draw right there. That's what you're looking for first, is to make sure that that server collation is set to that, because that's in the non-English, US English versions of SQL, that there may be a different server collation value, or you may have changed that because of your language. So just be aware of that and make sure that that's set to the correct value. Also here under memory, notice how everybody talks about how SQL will consume as much memory as you give it. Well, the reason why is because of these two settings right here. Your minimum and maximum server memory in megabytes. Notice the very large number of megabytes that's set here by default. Now I'm going to set this at 4096 for the minimum and the maximum because that's the amount of RAM that I have. If you don't set this to 8192 and 8192, you're going to get a little warning. It's not It's not a big warning. You're not prevented from installing, but Config Manager really wants 8 gigs and not just 4 gigs. I just simply don't have 8 gigs to give around, here in my virtual environment. If you are following along at home too, putting somewhere between 2 and 4 gigs is probably a good idea for your Config Manager virtual machine, just here in the demo environment. You don't have to have the full 8 for demonstrating this. So those are the 2 settings you have to have here for the SQL Server itself. One of the other things we want to do is under security and logons, you'll notice how I've already added the SMS admin account here. I did that by right-clicking and choosing new logon and adding in the SMS account. When I did that, the only other thing that I've done with this account is under properties here, for server roles, I need to give it the sysadmin role. So all this does is link the Active Directory account for SMS admin to the SQL privileges that I want to give it here inside of the SQL Server. Okay, so that gives it the privileges it needs in order to generate that SMS database. We're not really ready yet. Okay, I mean, if I go here under Start and Computer, I've got the Config Manager DVD in the drive right now. But we're not really ready yet because we have a couple of things that we have to do in Active Directory to support what we're trying to do here. Now I'm going to RDP over to my domain controller, which in this domain is dc.company.pri. And when I do that, let me plug in my credentials here. This is going to log me into my domain controller. From that location, what I want to do is I want to show you the system container that you'll find in ADSI Edit. First of all, before we do that, let's actually spend a minute here in Active Directory users and computers. Because if you haven't played with ADSI Edit before and you're understandably a little cautious about it, I just kind of want to show you that under the View item, if you choose Advanced Features, that will make available some of these additional containers that are not always available in your ADUC by default. Down here under the System container, in a subfolder of this System container is where we're going to create this Systems Management folder. Okay, so if you're more comfortable with the ADUC, you can kind of see things in here. I'm going to show you how we actually create the container using ADSI Edit. Here's ADSI Edit. I'm going to connect up to my default naming context here. That's the well-known naming context where the system container actually exists. There's my domain, company.pri, and there's system. And if I right-click on system and choose new object, I need to create a container. And the container's name is going to be System Management. Okay, again, very important, the spelling and the capitalization and the space there. When I'm done creating that container, the next thing that we have to do is give the privileges to the Config Manager, the Config Manager server, so that the Config Manager server can update the contents of this container. Okay, there's an automated process whereby your entire Config Manager infrastructure is going to update these records whenever it needs to. And in order to do that, I have to provide the right level of security for the container. Now to do that, I click here on Security. This is fairly similar to how you would add security for an NTFS permission, for example. I do have to change the object type here to add in computers because what I'm looking for is Config Manager 1, Config MGR 1. So this computer object needs full control over that container for system management. Okay? That's step 1. Step 2 actually happens back on your Config Manager server, and we're not going to use that installer just yet. We're instead going to go here to, to the D drive, and in the SMS setup location, and bin and x64 here, and what we're looking for is a little command line tool called extaddsch. Okay, this command, which has been around for a couple of versions now, it's kind of an acronym that stands for extend the Active Directory schema. And if I run that command, it just goes boop and does whatever it needs to do. and it's gone. Now, most of us have to go through all kinds of approval from generally non-technical individuals where we have to prove that we know what we're doing before they'll give us the yay verily that I can double click that. I don't know, in all of my years of IT, the terms extend the Active Directory schema, more so than any other terms, they make our non-technical managers, they make their skin crawl. So does this happen to you too? So from my perspective, I've stopped actually calling it extend the Active Directory schema. I just now call it just adding a couple of new clients and attributes to the database. Strangely, it actually works because extend the schema sounds worse than what it really is. When you double click that, it will provide for you a log file and the root of C that gives you some explanation about what it's done. Okay, I already updated the schema for this domain back in the Exchange or Config Manager 2007 days. So some of these already exist. But you can see here that there are some items that got updated. And down here we can see that we've successfully extended the Active Directory schema. Okay, so there's your validation that you've got a successful schema update. Obviously you have to be a schema admin in order to support this. Now what's interesting is that generally what happens in the world of people who, the people who don't know what they're doing, making us prove that we do know what we're doing, they want to know, okay, well, what in the heck are you doing? All right, you tell me what you're doing to the Active Directory schema, and I'll give you the approval. Well, unfortunately, many of us just can't really say because we just don't know. Well, when you double-click this item here, what it's actually doing is running an LDF file here called Config Manager AD schema. Now, it's mapped here to a SQL Server database file, but it's actually not that. In fact, you can open up this file. It's a human-readable file. If I open it up in Notepad, I believe, I should be able to read the contents of this file. So when they tell you, you can't do this until you prove to us what goes on, well, here's what goes on. This LDF file contains the instructions for what needs to be changed in the Active Directory to support this schema extension. And if we go past some of the initial stuff here, you'll see that what's actually happening is relatively benign. Okay, this first one adds a new attribute for SMS capabilities. Okay, an attribute, it updates the MS SMS management point class, and here's what happens. Okay, this is the distinguished name, essentially the path of where the change is going to happen. It's going to add something. There's an object class of attribute schema in this essentially folder location. Here's the ID. There's the syntax. There's the GUID. And then down here, go ahead and update the schema now. Okay, that's what it's doing. And in fact, if you go through all of these little schema or these little instruction files, this one adds the management point class, and this one adds the site class and the roaming boundary range class. And this gives you the ability to essentially know what's going to go on. And the proof, the validation, as it were, that you're not going to do anything that's going to impact your existing stuff. It's generally adding things here. Now, one of the reasons why we use that extaddsch command instead of running this LDF file by itself is because in this distinguished name, you'll notice that there's a wildcard here for your domain name. And by double-clicking the exe file, it just makes things easier. You would have to replace this with your actual full path for it to function. So hopefully that gives you some, at least a better understanding of how schema extensions work, but also a better understanding of how the schema extension for Configuration Manager works too, because I'm like you. I want this thing to just work, and getting it through all of the approvals is one of the steps in that process. Now, once everything's done, you can bring up put the DVD in the drive, and then click that little link, which I clicked almost too fast for you. I apologize for that. To launch this installation prerequisite check. Okay, and what this is it's a kind of an ID10T light against your server and your entire configuration. Okay, and if there are any errors, you will not be allowed to install Config Manager. We're preventing you from doing something silly. If there are warnings, however, these warnings are not going to prevent Config Manager from doing what it's going to do, but they're just things that you should probably fix. The idea is you should probably fix them before you do the installation, but it's not going to prevent the installation from happening. The first one is the making sure that you have a WSUS SDK on the site server. You can install this later. Okay, in fact, I'm actually going to install it later because I want to take the WSUS stuff and move it to the updates nugget so everything's kind of there in one location. The other one is this SQL Server process memory allocation, which says that you have to have a minimum of 8 gigs of RAM for a CAS, a central administration site, or a primary site. Okay, I only have 4 gigs of RAM, so I'm going to get an error message here. But this is okay, because neither of these are errors. I'm actually going to be allowed to install the software. Let's go ahead and do that now. All right, so here, the first page of this installer says, make sure you have everything going. Make sure you've met the minimum requirements. And now we have a choice. So back in that last nugget, I was talking about how for the entirety of this series, we are not going to do the central and primary configuration because it's just added complexity that we don't need. Right now, what we want to install is a Configuration Manager primary site. This will be, I believe there's an error message that pops up. It'll be up here in just a second. This will be a single site that can never be extended. Like we'll never be able to add secondaries or other primary sites to it, or well, other primary sites to it. But once I set up this primary site, I'm kind of locked into this single site configuration. Okay. If you want to fast forward to nugget number 20, where I explain all the differences between the central administration site and the single server, single site scenario, you might want to do that. But for now, because we want to keep things simple, I'm just going to do a primary site for this demo environment. Next slide is product key, either eval or your 25-character product key. I'll just throw this in an eval for now. Accept the license terms, and really all the license terms. And the next screen here will give me an option for downloading these additional installation files. Now, what needs to happen here is have a little, share here, not a little share, a little folder that you've created on this server, because this location for this share, if I've lost my, there we go. I lost my screen. This location for this share is going to be the location where the Config Manager installer is actually going to download additional files that are required in order to complete the installation. It's actually kind of brilliant, honestly. So Microsoft up on their servers has additional stuff like language files and things that need to be downloaded. And Microsoft can modify, obviously, the contents of those downloads if there's new updates or language files or whatever it needs to make sure gets installed the Configuration Manager right at the beginning so that you have a successful Config Manager install. So you can see here I'm actually downloading what appear to be the different language files at this point. There are 41 at least as of this point. There will likely be more as the years go on. Let me go ahead and pause the recording really quick, and when we come back I'll have all of these downloaded and we'll step on to the next phase in this installation. And we're back. Okay, 10 minutes or so. Not that much. Depends on obviously your download speed from the internet. Still have a couple of different things we have to do before we can complete the installation, not the least of which is to determine which languages we need. If you have additional languages, in this case for the console and reports, for the next screen is going to be for the client languages, you can make those available. Essentially download them and make them part of your installation. And you think about this, right? Because if you have a very large Config Manager infrastructure that spans multiple countries, you might need these languages for the people that exist in those countries and with those languages. Now this takes us to this screen here, which is for the site and installation settings. When you choose a site code, be very careful that you choose a site code that you intend on keeping. Generally, at least this was the way in the old days, once you used a site code, you kind of burned that site code forever. Um, I am unaware if that changes in 2012, but back in the old days, if you picked a three-letter site code, well, that site code you really didn't want to ever reuse because of where it was very sticky. It would kind of stick around in the environment and it was very difficult for you to remove it. I'm going to choose the site code NGT, okay, for Nugget, and I'm going to specify the site name, CBT Nuggets. You might change yours to something geographic, like Denver or this office in this location. The site name generally corresponds to, in a lot of the ones that I've seen, the geographic location where that site actually exists. Now, in most of our worlds, in the production environment, we would actually join this primary site to a central administration site. Okay, that allows us to have multiple primaries and also secondaries that attach up to a single hierarchy. Now, if you're a very small site and you don't ever intend on expanding beyond that single site scenario, you can install the primary site as a standalone site, so it kind of hybridizes the CAS and the primary roles together. Again, if you ever intend on extending beyond one site, don't do this. But if you do, then you can, because essentially you cannot extend that standalone site. In fact, there's the error message that says you've selected to install this as a standalone. You're not going to be able to join this primary site to a hierarchy after this site installs. Okay, so again, very important design decision to be made here, because you can't undo this. The only way you can undo this is to migrate away onto different servers in a different environment. So we will use a single site here just because, again, trying to keep things very simple so that we can go through the learning process. Server name here for the SQL database, I have SQL installed on the same server, config manager 1. Here's the instance name. I'm going to leave it blank to use the default instance. And then here's the database. So if you recall, back in Config Manager 2007, there were a lot of artifacts of the old SMS still kind of running around. And in fact, you'll see instances or mentions of SMS from time to time in various Config Manager pieces. It used to be called the database name SMS underscore in 3-digit site code. Now we finally changed it so it's CM underscore 3-letter site code. So just kind of interesting little history there that we're slowly getting rid of all the old mentions of SMS. Also, what port do I want to use for the SQL Server broker? I'm just going to use the default, which is detected automatically. So remember when I said SMS? And for some reason, they're just artifacts that never seem to get wiped out. Well, here is a perfect example of an artifact that is still around, which is the SMS provider used by Configuration Manager. The SMS provider, this is the mechanism that allows the site database to communicate with the Config Manager console. And if you think about that, it's kind of actually it's a smart idea, right? So if I have my database over here, and I have my console over here, this is on my workstation, do I really want my workstation to have direct access to the database? Probably not. Right? That would mean that, well, anything that this database would be willing to receive and do, it would have direct access there. That kind of seems like that would be a very insecure way of doing things. So the SMS provider kind of provides this intermediary, this middleware, if you will, that enables clients to talk to the database over just the published interfaces that we want the console to work with. So just think of it as a piece of middleware. It can be on this server, which obviously is, but notice here that the provider cannot be installed on a server that's configured for SQL Server clustering. Okay, so you'll have to do something else if you're in that high availability scenario. I'm going to use this server just to keep things simple here. When we get to nugget number, I believe it's 19, we start talking about, at the very end, about how we can secure client communication and enable mobile device management. That is an exceedingly complex topic. And in fact, the process to go through enabling client communication, secure client communication, is really, really tough. Mostly because in order to do that, you have to have a fully functioning PKI infrastructure with auto enrollment for all of your clients and devices and servers and everything, I think I will be creating something like 4 certificate templates in order to support this when we get to that nugget way, many nuggets hence. So a lot of environments, although this sounds like a good idea, the creation and management of a fully functioning PKI infrastructure makes this really hard. So don't feel bad if you choose the bottom one here. In fact, it's kind of silly that Microsoft puts this as the default, because if you turn this on, your config manager infrastructure is only going to work if you have the infrastructure and the certs and everything already in place. It's almost like it's harder to do it that way. So don't feel bad if you turn this on, and just wait until the 19th nugget, and I'll show you how we can actually enable this, and you can tell me if you actually dig it or not. From what I understand, in the 07 days, that level of client communication was challenging enough that a very small percentage of all sites globally ever turned it on. So again, don't sweat it if you feel bad for clicking that bottom button. We'll talk about MPs and DPs a little later on. Management points are the point of communication between the client and the server. The distribution point is the location where your packages and your applications end up getting stored. Okay, much more conversation about coming up here in future nuggets. Do you want to join the Experience Improvement Program? We always want to. Actually, if you're one of the people that don't really trust Microsoft with that data, it's interesting that the instrumentation that they get out of that really helps them solve problems with products. And so I know a lot of us are we can get fussy sometimes about giving them our data, but it actually does provide worthwhile data to help them improve the product. And that's really it. That completes the installation. I'll click the next button here, and that should begin installing. So this will complete the process of getting that whole installation ready to go. I'm going to pause one more time, and after we come back, we will have completed the prerequisite check. We will have completed the installation, and we'll be ready to actually take a look at our config manager infrastructure here coming up. So let me go ahead and pause the recording. I'm going to click the begin install button, and we'll be ready to go. And we're back. This says 32 minutes of elapsed time, although the actual elapsed time is probably closer to 10 to 15. But you can see here that the install has completed at this point, and we have nice green check boxes next to all the different steps that have actually occurred. I can view the log here, and the config manager setup log will tell me all the different steps that it accomplished in installing the tool. And you can see down here at the bottom that we've actually completed the config manager server setup. So we're doing well here at this point. If I click the close button here and minimize this, you'll see that here under all programs I now have System Center 2012. What I don't see is actually the System Center console, right? The administrative console. I have the setup screen here, but not actually the console itself. That console I can get back here on the DVD by selecting Install Config Manager Console, and then clicking through the usual setup screens, config mgr1.company.pri for the site server name I'm connecting to. There's the installation folder. Join the program and install this. This will actually complete installing that Config Manager Console. Now again, the whole idea for this is you want to install this on your desktop and not necessarily on the server. Because from your desktop you can have all the tools that you need, your automation tools, your packaging tools, essentially everything that you'll be adding into this config manager server as metadata. So in this environment, again, this is a demo environment, so installing it here is going to be just fine. When I'm done, I'm actually going to launch this console, and the console should connect up right into our config manager infrastructure, connect right into the site database, again through that SMS provider, and then give me access to begin working here with my config manager infrastructure. Now, we're not even remotely sort of started yet. We're not even really ready to even start working with clients because we have a number of different tasks that we have to go through here in the hierarchy configuration and also in the site configuration to turn this initial site into something that clients can actually attach to. So that's really going to be the topic for the next series of nuggets. We'll talk about setting boundaries. We'll talk about turning on discovery methods and all the really good best practices that you can use for turning those on in the best way possible. So for now, however, what have we talked about in this nugget? And we've talked about the whole click-by-click process for preparing for and getting Config Manager 2012 installed on your server. We talked kind of about those hefty hardware and software requirements and how in order to support a whole lot of requirements, or a whole lot of clients, you're going to have some hefty hardware in order to do that. It is generally a good idea to have plenty of hardware because you don't want anything that's really going to slow down your interface with that Config Manager server. If it's not a pleasant interface, you won't use it, and then you don't really get any of the benefits of working with Config Manager. Then with some of that initial talk, we then went about the process of preparing Active Directory and the server itself for Configuration Manager, and then getting it installed. As I said, we've got quite a few tasks up remaining. In fact, a whole another 16 more nuggets after this one that we've got to go through in order to bring our entire Config Manager infrastructure into one of complete automation. So until then, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.